We're going to turn our attention to information that we've looked at in the past regarding the Jubilee year of 7 BC and information that shows similarities between the coming of Christ to end the world in the second Jubilee period of 1994, which would come to a close in 2033 AD. So we can see with that first coming of Christ that there are some very key dates, and that would be the year 13 BC, the 11,000th year from creation, the year 7 BC, the year Christ entered into the world, a Jubilee year on the Day of Atonement, and then this lull period of many years until the work of Christ begins in 29 AD, the 3.5-year period of ministry until going to the cross in 33 AD, when he would finish the task of demonstrating the atonement. So he has made the first Jubilee period to stretch from the birth of Christ, not just to 33 AD, but into the New Testament church age, which would go from 33 AD until 1988 AD. It was a time that God saved people using the churches and congregations of the world. And all those that were saved were likened to the first fruits unto God. And that's a long Jubilee year. Well, now let's look and compare and see the similarity with some dates that we're familiar with in the timeline that is derived from the biblical calendar of history. Let's start with the year 1988. The year 1988 is the 13,000th year of Earth's history. Now, again, when we look back, the year 5013 BC was the 6,000th year of Earth's history. The year 13 BC was the 11,000th year of Earth's history. And both of those periods were used of God to begin a tribulation that would lead to the flood in 4990, 23 years later, and lead to the birth of the Messiah in 7 BC, 2,300 days later from 13 BC. Well, in 1988, it was the 13,000th year of Earth's history, and that year also was the year the church age ended, or the first Jubilee, the first outpouring of the Holy Spirit, came to a close in 1988. And that's where the tribulation comes in of 2,300 evening mornings. And this was a grievous period wherein virtually no one was saved. And also, it was a period of time when there was no rain and no season. There was the time of first fruits that had just ended on May 21, 1988, the day before Pentecost. And the rain and the early rain ceased to fall. And at that point, God was not saving anyone within any church in all the world. The Holy Spirit came out of the church and Satan entered in. Virtually no one outside of the churches was saved. And we have to say virtually because the Bible in Revelation 8 speaks of about a half hour of silence. And the word that means silence allows for the littlest, slightest bit of noise. And so if there is virtual silence, would mean virtually no one is being saved. It could be that no one at all was saved, but we just make that allowance because the Bible leads us in that direction, that for the 2,300 evening mornings, for a period of 6 years and about 4 months, there was no one being saved until September 7th, 1994. So just as we had 13 BC and 2,300 evening mornings leading us to 7 BC, a Jubilee year, we have the year 1988, 2,300 evening mornings leading us to 1994. And what was special about the year 1994? It was a Jubilee year. The Jubilee in the Old Testament would be 57 or 07 in every century. And 7 BC was the year Christ was born, and that was the last Old Testament side of the cross Jubilee. It was the 28th Jubilee since 1407. And by the way, from 7 BC to 1994 is 2,000 years. And if you break down 2,000, according to Jubilees, that's 40 times 50. Every 50 years is a Jubilee period. And so 1994 would be the 40th since 7 BC. And even 2,000 years. Overall, since 1407 BC, 1994 is the 68th overall Jubilee. And 68 you can break down to 4 times 17. So the number 4 would point to the furthest extent, number 17 to heaven, as the Jubilee has everything to do with saving people and bringing them to heaven. But from 7 BC, when we project the Jubilee into the New Testament era, you go 7 plus 44, which is 51, and then you have to minus 1 because there's no year 0. So the year 44 AD was a Jubilee year. Then, 50 years later, 94 AD. Then in each following century, 144, 194, 244, 294, 1944, 1994 is a Jubilee year. And the next Jubilee, if we were to reach it, would be 2044. But 1994 is a Jubilee, and it stands in a special relationship to the Jubilee in which Christ was born, 7 BC. Because the first coming of Christ was after 11,000 years, remember? Plus 2,300 days. So we would expect, because the Bible relates the number 13 to the second coming of Christ and the end of the world. And there's just many verses that show that. We would expect when we get to the 13,000th year, the fullness of that thousands, which was 1988, and then follow the same pattern, 2,300 evening mornings, and then, just like in 7 BC, there stands another Jubilee of 1994. See, that relationship between 1994 and 7 BC and 1988 and 13 BC is unique. It's unique. They stand in exactly the same position some 2,000 years later. As a matter of fact, from 13 BC until 1988, 2,000 years exactly. From 7 BC until 1994, 2,000 years exactly. Remember the minus 1 when you add those two numbers together. So they stand sort of parallel to one another, separated by 2,000 years, just as 33 AD is separated by 2,000 years from 2033 AD. And that's why we have to seriously look at 2033 AD as the possible year that Christ will return to complete the second Jubilee. You know, deliverance of the captives is not complete until God has completed his entire salvation, which involves the resurrection of the body. And so if it were the case that in 2033, God finally takes his people to heaven, destroys the earth and so forth, and equips them with a new resurrected body, that's part of saving them. That's part of delivering them. That's part of what Jesus as the Jubilee came to do. It would be the fulfillment, the completion of his work as the one who made atonement for them, as the one who has set them free from sin, because now they're finally set free from sin in their body. So that is related to the Jubilee, to the work of the atonement that Christ performed. And so we have two dates, 1988 and 1994, that are 2,000 years into the future from 13 BC and 7 BC. And we have 7 BC and 1994 as Jubilee years. And so on September 7th, 1994, God once again indicated a Jubilee year. And so it was another outpouring of the Holy Spirit, a second time. A second outpouring of the Holy Spirit. And all those that were saved were likened to the great multitude. And the Bible speaks of a mysterious second time in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 10, "And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, which shall stand for an ensign of the people. To it shall the Gentiles seek, and his rest shall be glorious. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria and from Egypt and from Pathros and from Cush and from Elam," and so forth. A second time. Also, in the book of Jonah, we read that God commanded Jonah to go to Nineveh, and Jonah went to Tarshish on the ship. He fled. But then God, after stopping him by having a raging sea and leading the mariners to cast him overboard, where he was swallowed by the whale, and the whale vomited him out onto dry land, and the dry land happened to be Nineveh, where the Lord wanted him to go. It says in Jonah 3, "And the word of Jehovah came unto Jonah the second time, saying, Arise, go unto Nineveh, that great city, and preach unto it the preaching that I bid thee." A second time.